My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and thrilled to be with you today. We are reading in our virtual reading group, The Life of the Mind. It's the new critical edition for those of you who are using it. And We're currently in volume 2 on willing. Um, Remember, the book is divided into 3 volumes: Thinking, Willing, and Judging. Sadly, um, Judging was never written. The title page was in the typewriter when Arendt died in 1975. This is the 50th anniversary of her death in December. Um, and we'll be having a number of events at the Arendt Center and around the world commemorating her in December. Um, the the book is on Thinking and Willing, um, is really looking at two of the primary preoccupations of Arendt through all of her writing life. So the thinking chapter, as we discussed in the months that we were reading that, is about um, meaning, what it means for man to be a meaningful being. She says that thinking is not the same as knowing. It doesn't lead to truth. Thinking is about making meaning, or of discovering meaning. And we spent some great sessions talking about the importance of thinking as a way of um, figuring out what it means to live a meaningful life. Also, thinking as potentially a prophylactic against evil. Um, we're now in the second volume of the work on willing, and we're in the second chapter, which is about the discovery of the inner man. Now, just as thinking is about the making of meaning, and man is a meaning-making being, the willing chapter is about another essential aspect of what it means to be human for Arendt, which is freedom. Um, in each of these chapters in this book, we are pursuing willing and the will as a problem of freedom. Will, insofar as the will exists, and remember, the Greeks didn't even think about the will. The Greeks mostly simply thought that we have thinking, which tells us what is logical or right, and we have desiring, which tells us what we want. Um, and they didn't conceive a term like willing, which is sort of in between. The exception to that would be Aristotle with his idea of prohairesis, which we talked about the last two weeks. But for Arendt, will cannot be the same as thinking, right? Thinking it necessitates us, in the sense that if we think what's rational or logical, we have to do it. Um, Thinking is free. It's a kind of pure spontaneity. Either our will is free, Arendt says, and that means that it's caused by nothing. It's not caused by God or by neurons or by a first cause, or the will is an illusion and it doesn't really exist. And yet, if will is truly free, if it's not constrained either by the intellect or the mind on the one hand, or the body and desires on the other, well, then the will can lead us to do almost anything, including evil. Um, and that's the problem of the will, which is the problem of freedom. And Arendt's, one of her continual preoccupations in her work, is that philosophy ignores intentionally the problem of the will, and thus the fact of freedom, because if you are free and you have the will, then we don't have to act rationally. And philosophy, and many philosophers, especially when it comes to political philosophy, believe that we should act rationally. Like Plato wants us not to act according to doxa, but acts according to truth. And so this for her is the source of the philosophical hostility to the idea of will and of freedom. The result is that for her, the philosophy of the will only really becomes central with the Christian philosophers, right? The Christians discovered the problem of the will and thus the problem of freedom because they took seriously the problem that we are sinful, fallen creatures, right? The first principle, or one of the first principles of Christianity, is that we are prideful and we fall and we are sinful, right? Original sin. And as a result, we are immediately aware of what St. Paul tells us, which is that I will to do what God tells me. I will to do what's right and moral, but I cannot. And for Paul, this is a problem. We have that, and this is why this chapter is called the discovery of the inner man. It's about this inner conflict in the soul of all human beings, right? I will what is good, what God commands, but I can't do it. Now, Paul calls that the problem of two laws, right? There's a rational law and the law of the members. Now, Augustine, who's writing, within the church that Paul helped to found, no longer is able to talk about two laws because that would be heresy, insofar as there's only one law, right? God's law. And so Augustine sees the same experiences, the same problem as Paul, and changes it from the conflict in my soul between two laws, the law of reason and the law of thy members, to the to the will of two wills. I have a spiritual will and a carnal will. And this is really designed to avoid the charge of heresy and Manichaeanism. Um, and so Augustine changes the Pauline formulation around and says, I can will, right, God's will, or I can nil, I can go against God's will. And thus, Augustine is the beginning of putting will at the center of the human experience of freedom, and putting freedom at the center of the human experience. The act of will is this spring of action. It comes from nowhere. And thus, Augustine, as many of you know, is the thinker that Arendt credits with bringing the idea of natality into the Western tradition. This idea of natality, which is a formulation of the idea of birth, says that we humans are born twice, once literally as little babies who cry, and secondly, born into the world and language. And as such, we are a beginning. And in that beginning, we can start things anew. We have freedom. Now, Arendt values this Augustinian discovery of human freedom as the power to begin, but she also is going to reject Augustine's attempt to see the will, and all Christian thinkers attempt to see the will as simply an internal faculty of the mind. So the Christians discover the will and discover freedom, but they limit it to the idea of, am I free? Do I have free will? And freedom is this internal idea. It denies or ignores the political and external ideas that freedom for Arendt is not just about, do I have the freedom to raise my hand, or do I have the freedom to will God's will, or or go to theater, which is against, for Augustine is one of his great examples of evil, going to theater. But for her, freedom is the ability to actually do things in the world and build a common world with other people. It's political freedom, which even the Christian philosophers, for the most part, ignore. And so that's going to be her eventual critique of this idea of the philosophy of willing and freedom. But in this particular section, that's not what we're engaged in. We're trying to understand the basic discovery of the will and of freedom as a philosophical problem. And while Augustine, as she will say in section 10, which we'll get to in a second, is the first philosopher of the will, she has already talked to us about St. Paul, who is the philosopher of two laws, and in a sense is the precursor of all Christian philosophy of the will and freedom. But here she's going to talk about Epictetus, who is a contemporary of Paul's, and but he's not a Christian. He's a slave, a former slave, and a Stoic and a freed man. And you may recall that we spent a fair bit of time talking about Epictetus back in volume 1 on thinking, where we read in section 16 about the Roman answer to the question of why we think. For Epictetus, we think because we have to overcome, we want to be happy, right? That's the sort of fundamental idea. And we need to avoid the wretchedness of life. And philosophy realizes, Stoic philosophy realizes, that we can't impact the world. We can't make the world a good world or a happy world. And so we have to learn to live what he calls the art of living, which is we have to focus on what we can control. And since we can't control the external world, we can change ourself. And so Stoic philosophy turns inward. And the wise man for Epictetus cuts himself off from the world. He is attempting to have what he calls apatos, or the lack of feeling. Who refuses to react to whatever befalls you, right, good or evil. And he says, well, yeah, of course I have to die at some point, but I don't have to die sighing. I don't have to die moaning. I can die with equanimity. And so the art of living for the Stoics and for Epictetus is the extraordinary act of training our will to tune out the world and common sense. It's a radical withdrawal from the world. And so the philosophy for the Stoics becomes a science, right? And it is a science as they imagine it, that elevates my internal consciousness to the center of all thinking at the exclusion of the world. And so they develop an I, a concept of the I, or the ego, that is a refuge from reality. It's kind of sovereign, floats around, but is not concerned with reality. And this retreat from reality is for our end, as she talked about in section 16 in thinking, one of the great temptations of all philosophy and all thinking, right? Hegel, in her reading, sees the world as an unfolding of thought, of absolute spirit. There's a reconciliation with the world, but thought is ultimately, more important than the world. Plato turns us away from the world to the world of ideas, and the Stoics turn us away from the world to the world of consciousness. Now, in the book on willing, in this chapter 9, section 9 of the chapter on the internal conflict in the willing book, Epictetus is returned to, because the turn away from the world and the concern only with oneself is what allows us to, in a sense, assert power over the world and ourselves, right? We have to train, as I said before, we have to train ourselves to not concern with the world. But now what we have to do is train our will not to be fearful. Because what Epictetus says is, what makes us unhappy is not the fact that we die, because once we're dead, we don't know it, right? What makes us unhappy is not even the fact of getting stabbed, because once we're stabbed, we have to deal with it, and you're in motion and whatever. What makes us unhappy Epictetus says is that we're fearful, that we're afraid of dying, and we're afraid of being stabbed. And the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And so the art of Epictetus's philosophy, or Stoic philosophy, is to train ourselves to not be fearful. Since we can't control the world, we can turn inside and learn to control our mind. There's a kind of Buddhist aspect to Epictetus, if you like. I'm not an expert on Buddhism, but I think there's at least some ways in which one can see a Buddhist element to this, to Stoicism, and that the idea is to turn inward to yourself and control your mind and have such sovereignty over your mind that you are not fearful of anything. And the second part of that is that we so fully turn inward and control our mind that we always, in the effort to be happy, we simply always will the world as it is, right? The counter will to the world, to amor fati, not amor, well, it could be amor mundi too, but the love of the world, the will to the world being as it is, the counter will, that I will the world to be differently, needs to be overcome. And Epictetus says this is the discord in all of us, is that we sometimes will the world to be differently, but we have to train ourselves to be stoic, to will the world as it is. And that means that we, in a sense, will our own omnipotence. And here's a difference that she points out between Epictetus and Paul, right? For Paul, all obedience presumes the power to disobey, right? If I'm going to obey the law, I have to be able to disobey the law. For Epictetus, but this becomes the core of his philosophy. There's the law I have to obey, which means I could disobey. I have the power to say yes or no. Everything depends on my will. I am omnipotent. It becomes the center. And so all omnipotence, however, which presumes the possibility of disobedience, means that the will is what becomes the source of all experience of human freedom, on page 270, as Arendt writes. Since all things depend on my will, I am free to either will things as they are or be a rebel. That's my omnipotence. And to the extent that I will things as they are, I train myself to Stoicism, I am the source of the world. And so for Arendt, Epictetus gives us the clearest expression of a philosophy of pure willpower. Nietzsche is often seen as a sort of neo-Epicurean, Epictetian. And the will for Epictetus is posited as absolute and sovereign, but not over the world, right? That's where he and Nietzsche will disagree, but only over the self. In contrast, Augustine, who we're going to get to now, sees the will as torn, right? And again, Epictetus sees the will as torn, but one that I have to train myself to overcome that tear. In a sense, there's a kind of omnipotent solution to the problem, which is that I train myself to no longer be divided, to no longer have my will be divided. Augustine doesn't think we can do that, right? Augustine thinks that the will is always torn between sin and following the law of my mind, the law of spirit. And unlike Epictetus, there's always going to be conflict. Or Epictetus tries to eliminate that conflict through discipline, a kind of self-mastery. Whereas Augustine is going to say that conflict is what opens the door for grace or forgiveness. Both Epictetus and Augustine are going to wrestle with the will at the center of the self, but Epictetus aims to make the will godlike through training, whereas Augustine reveals that the will is divided and fragile and needs the redemption of God. And Arendt clearly prefers the Augustinian version in this, because Augustine doesn't flee from this fundamental division in the will, which in Arendtian terms could be thought of as plurality, right? There's always a plurality, and we need to not flee this plurality, but actually figure out how to live within it without banisters, if you will. Section 10 on Augustine, called The First Philosopher of the Will, begins with Augustine as exploring the failure of the will, right, to achieve happiness, right? Unlike Epicurus, I'm sorry, I keep saying that. Unlike Epictetus, who seeks to train the will to learn self-mastery, Augustine is constantly confronting his weakness and the failure of his will. If you read his to me, his greatest book, Confessions, I mean, it's to be constantly reminded of our inability to do what is right and our constant will to do what is wrong. And thus, he's confronted every day of his life, in every minute of his life, with the weakness of his will and thus the problem of evil. And he needs a Christian solution. And so Arendt, honestly, this is 20. I'm sorry, Jess, can you mute everybody? Just so we don't have noise interfering. In what's really 23 or 24 pages, Arendt does an extraordinary reading of the corpus of Augustine. Now, obviously not about everything. She sort of has this idea that he's not a systematic thinker, nor is she. And she's saying, look, I'm not trying to read a complete reading of Augustine, but I'm going to take one constant preoccupation of his throughout his life, namely the problem of freedom and will, and do a reading of it. And she reads it through 4 books. His first book that deals with this is on the free choice of the will. And she divides that into 2 parts. So the first section, beginning on page 273 in the critical edition, is an account of what he says in the first 2 parts on free choice of the will. And the basic point here is that since evil cannot come to be without a cause, right? If there's evil in the world, there must be a cause. And since God is good, so God cannot be the cause of evil, right? For Augustine, there's 2 wills, right? In all humans. There's the carnal will and the spiritual will. But both belong to one person, one will that is struggling within someone named Augustine. And one will says you must will what God says, the spiritual will, and the other will says you must do what your members say, your carnal will. But the will is free to do either one. And if that's the case, in every moment and in every choice we're faced with, we're choiced with willing the spiritual will or nilling and following the counter will. And there's this fundamental discord in the soul. And Augustine asks, well, what is the source of this will that leads to this discord? And on one hand, he follows Paul and says that the source is simply the law. And this is, of course, a theologically very problematic interpretation, because what both Paul and Augustine say on one level is that God's law leads to sin, because without the law, there's no sin. If you don't have the law, there's no counter will, counter law. And so while this is a Pauline thought, Augustine interprets it differently. And Arendt's summary, which basically says that Augustine and Paul need there to be a law because they need there to be sin, because only with sin is there grace, right? So this is, of course, a theologically contentious argument, and it's a bit oversimplified, but it's true that Augustine's uh, fundamental approach here is to say that the cause of the will is the law, which leads to evil, but leads to grace. Um, and that's and again, a lot of Christian thinkers have struggled with this, and a lot of Christian philosophers have struggled with it. But the fundamental background to this is the biblical story of the prodigal son, right? For those of you not so familiar with your Bible these days, the prodigal son, there's a man, he has two sons, a good son and a prodigal son. The good son does what he's told. He gives them both their inheritance, and the good son saves it. The prodigal son goes out and spends it. He goes into exile, and when he is totally bereft, he comes back to his father and says, "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned." And the father is happy because his son has come home. He sacrifices a lamb and has a party. And the good son says, "Hold on a second. I'm the good son. I did everything right. Why are you celebrating the bad son?" And the father famously says, my son was lost and now he is returned. Um, uh, Hegel's reading of this in the Philosophy of the Right uh, comes down to me, one of the most important lines of all Hegelian and moral philosophy or legal philosophy, that the law only comes to work in the cancellation or the reconciling of its injury, right? Das Recht nur kommt zu Werk in der Aufhebung seiner Verletzung. I think it's in section 97, if I have it right, of the Philosophy of Right. What this means is that you can never fully love and know the law until there's a crime and the punishment of the crime, right? And this is Hegel in the Philosophy of Right. This is his justification for punishment, right? You remember that he's writing against utilitarians like Mill and Bentham, who say, look, punishment is a necessary evil. And to the extent we can, make people do the right thing without punishing them, that's better. And Hegel says, no, sir, right? You actually need punishment, because the only way you truly come to believe the law and not just follow it out of custom or habit is to break the law, be punished, and then reconnect with the law. So that's sort of the issue that Augustine is raising and addressing in his first book on the free will. The second book that Arendt really focuses on is Confessions, right? And here the point is that Augustine realizes that there's a monstrosity to the idea that the mind commands and the body obeys, and yet the body disobeys. And so how do we deal with this problem? And the Manichaeans dealt with it, who, remember, Augustine was a Manichaean until he rejects it and convert and, in a sense, realizes his sin and comes back to Christianity. The Manichaeans said there's actually multiple forces in us, good and evil, and even more. And Augustine says no, right? There may be two wills, but they have to be united, because in the end, we need to unite ourselves in God, and they're brought together in love. Well, how does that work, right? And Arendt says, is this a deus ex machina? And she's going to give us an answer to it. But first, she has this little digression on Mill, John Stuart Mill, who says that, and she says that Mill is actually the modern solution to the conflict of will, in that what he teaches us is that through utilitarian education, we can teach people what their will should be, right? We can educate them. And this is the liberal solution to the problem of free will, is that we educate them. And if I've mentioned it before, but the really great modern book on liberalism as a theory of education is Uday Mehta's book, Liberalism and Empire, in which he talks about how John Stuart Mill, right, the same John Stuart Mill, defended empire and defended the imperial oppression of colonial peoples, England and India, as necessary because the natives, as in his opinion, were not yet educated enough to live freely in a liberal society. And so until they are educated enough, liberalism defends empire. And this is the Mill's solution to the problem of how you deal with these two, the will and the counter will. That brings, so then Arendt comes back to Augustine's solution in his book on Trinity. And the problem here is that there's a Trinity in Christianity, the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost, and yet they're all different, and yet they're all one. And the paradigm for this difference within unity, or unity within difference, is friendship, right? That in friendship, the friends are independent, and yet we are also a unity. Arendt makes a lot of this in her thinking about friendship. I have a book that just finishing up on that, so you'll get to read it in a year. But the basic idea is that for her, friendship means respecting each other in their difference, and yet still finding something that joins us together, binds us together in a common endeavor. Within our intellect, right, there's also three faculties, not the Father, Son, the Holy Ghost, but memory, intellect, and will. And what Arendt says that for Augustine, will is what unifies these three. It unifies memory. It tells us what to remember and what forget. It also tells the intellect what to choose. And in doing so, will is the bond that connects the whole mind as memory and intellect. Will is for her the spring of action that binds man's sensory apparatus to the world. So if I see you guys sitting there in this Zoom room, right? There's you guys, the object, right? There's my vision which sees you. So, and then there's the will which tells me I should attend to you, I should look at you. Will is the coup d'etat that redeems the act. And she borrows this metaphor of the coup d'etat from Bergson. It's on 286 in the critical edition. And it's a vivid metaphor, right? That will is this thing that connects my memory and my intellect. It connects the object seen with my intellect. And it's a kind of idea that the will is a seizure of power. But she also realizes that that's not exactly what Augustine meant. For Augustine, the will operates in a more gradual synthesis of my will with grace. And she says that for Augustine, the foundation of the way that will unifies memory and intellect, or Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost, or my will and my counter will, is love, right? That will is transformed into love in Augustine's book on Trinity. And Arendt emphasizes this transformation because it marks Augustine's decisive move beyond a divided and conflictual will toward a unified human self. Remember, in Augustine, there's two kinds of love. There's cupiditas, right? Love turned toward the self, a kind of carnal love, and caritas, love turns toward God or the eternal. And depending on which love you have, it's depending on two wills, right? There's the carnal will, and the spiritual will. And caritas is an act of the will that orients itself towards the good, or God. And in that sense, love is not simply a passive feeling, but a volitional force. It's a kind of coup d'etat, a kind of will that chooses and binds. And it binds my counter will to my spiritual will. for Augustine, love doesn't resolve the conflict between my two wills by force, but it does so by reorienting the will towards God as its proper end. And you can see the connection with Mill there, right? Mill is a secular version of Augustine, in this sense. For Mill, it requires secular education to reorient my counter will to the spiritual will. For Augustine, it's not about education, it's in love or grace. And this idea that love is what, in a sense, allows the divergence in the will, the disorder or disunity in the wills, to be both to be transcended and yet also endure. The point is that love, as a kind of friendship here, allows there to remain the will and the counter will. Unlike Epictetus, we don't train the counter will away. We somehow embrace both and yet choose God. And thus love endures. But here's the kicker, right? And this is profound stuff that this is important for our end. Love endures, but it achieves its permanence not through control or mastery, that would be Epictetus, but kind of a surrender to devotion. Love endures, but only as love itself, neither as the lover or the beloved. And you gotta think about your experience of love or friendship, right? You're in love or you're in friendship with someone. There's you, the beloved, the lover. There's your beloved. There's you and your friend. What is friendship or what is love? It's not either you or the other. Your lover doesn't have to become you, and you don't have to become your lover. But friendship is the enduring, temporally enduring, a permanent bond without either side of the bond having predominance. This echoes, right, Augustine's theology that there's a true love that transcends the ego of the lover and also the object of the love, which participates in the eternal. And this means for Arendt that what bonds in the will is not love, is not the lover or the beloved, is not either of the two wills, but is love alone or will alone. Now, I think it was 2 weeks ago that we had a very interesting conversation in this group about Arendt's idea of progress and her skepticism about progress, and also her skepticism about social justice. This is in many ways another way of understanding Arendt's skepticism about social justice, because she writes on page 288, right, that men do not become just by knowing what is just, but by loving justice. An extraordinary sentence that I think is deeply Arendtian, right? It challenges all rationalist ideas that justice is knowable, whether you're a Kantian or whether you're a utilitarian, right? We can never know what is just. Justice always has to remain something abstract, right? So whether your issue is, is abortion just or not, or is, welfare just or not, from Arendt's point of view, social justice is not something we can know. Loving justice means embracing justice as an end in itself, with a kind of joy and existential unity without the concrete. And this is an Arendtian ethical insight that love motivates action in a way that transcends calculation or duty. It is love that humanizes justice and makes justice something we live rather than something we achieve. She's pointing, I think, towards a political ethical idea in which love of the world or affirmation is central, right? That love is something that we simply affirm and create. It's a devotion to shared values rather than to achieving any particular end. And so justice is to be understood here as love, not as a doctrine. And there's no social doctrine of justice. So we can come back to that in the Q&A if you want. The last part of the chapter is about the city of God. That's the fourth book she talks about. And in that book, she talks about how in willing and loving, and willing and in the loving will that unites the two wills, but the bond of loving and willing keeps both wills present. It's a free act that comes from nowhere. And this is the model that she takes for the beginning of man and human freedom. The freedom of the will is a kind of initio, as she talks about in the human condition, or a human beginning. She's very clear that this is not the core of Augustine's teaching, but it was there, and she takes it out for her purposes. And yet she's going to focus much of her political thinking and her critique of the Augustinian idea of free will as an internal struggle. She's going to take from Augustine. So she actually critiques Augustine with Augustine. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I know that was a bit of a longer introduction, but these are complicated chapters, and we live at a time in which many people don't know much about Augustine or Christian philosophy anymore. And so it's worth, I hope, worth providing. Let me just remind you, and I think Jess will put this in the chat if they haven't already. We are in the final 3 or 4 days of our membership drive. We do ask that, I mean, the virtual reading group is a benefit of membership, and thus, if you haven't had a chance yet to renew your membership or start your membership, please do so. We'd really appreciate it. It means a lot to us, and it helps us continue to do what we're trying to do. Thank you all very much. It's time for the discussion. You can either engage in the chat. Please be civil and you know, there's complicated issues here. You try and figure it out. I love that. I don't have time to spend much time reading it, so Jess may monitor it and can always add something in if they want. Or you can go down to the react button and raise your hand, and I'd love to hear you engage in the conversation. Great. John, you're up first.
Hi, Roger. Thank you. I'm trying to understand Arendt primarily as a political thinker. I believe she identified herself as primarily a political thinker. So, say Epictetus is severely apolitical, as a gymnosophist or a Buddhist is, that they're primarily concerned with personal salvation. So when she's talking about the will, she's talking about it to understand a political will. All right. First of all, my understanding of Bergson's term, coup d'etat. The coup d'etat, as in my understanding, is that the struggle between willing and nilling is resolved not by the will, but by an act or an action. That is to say, um, uh, you're caught between willing and nilling, and it cannot be resolved by the will. And so what emerges is either nothing, you know, kind of like Hamlet, just incapable of acting through thought, but it just happens. So, for example, in Hamlet, he's irresolute. He cannot decide what to do. He cannot do anything, And then he finds himself in a situation where he's fencing with Laertes, and the king has an idea to poison him and all the rest of it, and it just happens. He kills the king, uh, something he'd been thinking about, wanted to do, couldn't do it, but it just spontaneously happens. Now, in Arendt's explanation, that would be the coup d'etat. That is, an action resolves the irresoluteness of the will. Um, how does that happen? It's because of what she calls, or Augustine calls, love. And she describes it as a kind of gravity, a gravity of the soul, um, that it impels you to a certain act, the quality of your soul, the gravity of your soul. It impels you towards what you love. That is to say, what you are devoted to. All right, so that's my understanding of it, and I'm wondering if that is consistent with your understanding of it. Man,
Thanks.
the
Thanks,
coup
John.
d'etat. Yeah.
That's it's a long question with a lot behind it. And it's a good question. I just got to see if I can make sense of it. Um, so first of all, for Arendt, the will, right, can be the problem of the will is the problem of freedom. But
Mhm.
most philosophers, right, are not political philosophers. And a big part of her critique of philosophy is that they don't actually um, engage freedom. In fact, they find freedom a problem, and they spend their whole lives trying to control freedom. Uh, and so, you know, uh, much of the philosophy of the will that we're reading here is not political, right? In fact, um, it's apolitical. It's a philosophy of an internal dialogue. Um, where I become it's a discovery of the inner man, and I become a question for myself, as she puts it. But it's not political. So, um, you know, to the extent you're reading Arendt as a political philosopher, what is the use of these chapters? It's a good question. Um, to some degree, one could say they're not useful, right? These are the negatives of what she wants to argue. This is sort of the origination of the philosophical tradition of will and freedom that she is arguing against. And I think there's a fundamental truth to that. At the same time, um, if you want to understand will and freedom in politics, um, this is not at all irrelevant, because even though these people, these Christian philosophers, uh, imagined will in its apolitical internal sense, their the quality of their thinking about will is profound
Mhm.
and meaningful. Um, and one of the core uh, uh, insights, right, is that will is um, is in triplicate. It's just like the Trinity. It's not an accident, but that's what Augustine discovers, right? That in every will, there's the intellectual uh, desire or intellectual articulation of my will. I want ice cream, right? Then there's the attempt to get ice cream, and then there's the question of whether I actually get ice cream, right? And and um and humans have no power to actually get the ice cream. We don't, that's whether we actually get there or not depends on whether we get run over on the way. It's not up to us. Um, but will includes both the intellectual aspect and the effort, the attempt to do it, and that does bring us into the world, right? if we actually do believe that will includes the effort to actualize our will, um, that's the sort of connection into the world. The Hamlet story, which of course is a great story and very relevant. Um, you know, the killing of Laertes is not uh um an act of uh love, at least in the Augustinian sense, because there's no way that murder is going to be um a unifying idea of spiritual will. Um, even if and so um you know that's why I think the coup d'etat metaphor that she takes in from Bergson is not very. I mean, I think I understand why she does it. She wants to emphasize that Augustine has this problem of uh of of articulating of how to unify the two wills and yet also maintain their plurality and their difference. Um, and there's can't be a cause that does it, because that would implicate God in some way, and so it sort of has to happen. And yet, it's in the end, you can't understand or you can't read Augustine's idea here without the idea that all will, insofar as its will, even spiritual will, fails to achieve its end insofar as a human will, and therefore needs to depend on the grace of God in order to do so. Right? There is no fully uh, loving, successful human will. I mean, that's the struggle. If you read the Confessions, that goes through the end, where it gets there and back, there and back, there and back. You never get there because humans can't do that. Um, but yeah, I hope that's helpful. Is that helpful, John, or not? Maybe I missed it. Are you
You're
there?
muted.
John, you're muted. Yeah, I can't hear you.
Sorry. No, I didn't quite get it. My understanding is that the final resolution of the conflict of the will, of willing and nilling, comes through an action. Um, and and that and I see that as at the core of her political thinking. How do we move from thinking about something to doing something? And Augustine says that it's this gravity of love which brings all movement to a rest, to some kind of stability. Uh, Now, he talks about it in Christian terms, um, but love in Socratic terms is what your soul is devoted to.
Yeah.
He is a philosopher. He loves wisdom. He doesn't possess wisdom any more than we possess freedom or justice. We don't possess justice, but we love justice. And so we act out of a love for justice.
Yeah. So, John, yeah. I mean, the difference is that Arendt is not an Augustinian in her political philosophy, right? I mean, and so trying to uh, unite her with Augustine in the way I think you're, if I hear you, trying to do, is not going to succeed or work. For Augustine, everything depends on grace, and will is still evil. uh it's a real evil, and it needs to be, and it's freedom, and freedom is evil, but it needs to be resolved through grace. Arendt obviously doesn't come at it in that kind of a Christian way, and for her, will and action, as you put it, are not about sin or a counter will to good. There is no law that one wills against in political action because there's no truth in politics. For Arendt, there's simply plurality and many doxas and many viewpoints and many actions. And the the sort of challenge and beauty of human action is that people act, and we then have to in some way, um amidst all the different opinions and different actions, uh figure out how to build a common world. um and that's what politics is about for her. So freedom for her, is not going to be a will and a counter will in politics, because there's no law, or universal law, that freedom has to both reject, or action has to reject and then come back to.
Okay.
So you have to. I mean, I think she takes a lot out of Augustine, right? And I think reading Augustine helps deepen our understanding of it. But I don't think you can say that for Arendt, as for Augustine, love is um a kind of Christian love is the bond of the polis.
Okay. I don't want to extend. I would see it as a Socratic kind of love. But that's okay. We'll
Yeah,
let
I
it go.
mean, one. I just add, Aristotle does say that friendship is the bond of the polis. But friendship, and I think Arendt would agree with that. But
Right.
I think friendship in that sense is different from love. Um,
Yes.
and maybe that's what you mean by Socratic love, and that would be fine. But yes,
Yeah, yeah.
all right.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot, George.
Okay, I have two brief questions, and hopefully your answers will.
Sorry, George, you just
George, you just hit
got
mute
muted.
somehow.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, I have two brief questions. One is I realize that that Arendt and their reading of Socrates is not, I mean, and a reading of Augustine is not an Augustinian. That is, as far as she's concerned, I think her love of the world is not a rehearsal for going into heaven. So that I understand. I think that's not my question. My question is, really, as you were speaking about her take on Augustine, I was thinking, what would uh, the take would be of a typical, let's say, using Jean Amri as a Holocaust survivor? What would his be, the take on Augustine? Would it be closer to Arendt? And then my second question is, if there are different takes, one is obviously because he was a concentration camp and torture survivor. The second thing is he was Austrian, she was German, and the question of whether her vision always is sort of has to do with a Bildungsroman, new beginnings, etc., etc. Those are the two questions.
Uh, yeah, you're gonna have to. I mean, I don't know if you want to say more or not, George. I mean, what would Jean Marie's take on Augustine be? I have no idea. I mean, I've
Well, Jean Amory was anti-metaphysical, and he said, it's very hard to love the world if it hates you back.
yeah, yeah. I've read a little Amory, and I've heard some talks on him. Um, I don't feel like I have. I don't feel qualified to give an opinion on what Jean Marie would say about Augustine. Um, so I just don't know if I can answer that, George. I apologize.
All right, that's fine. If somebody else comes in with something that would. And the second thing, whether how much of Arendt's views were, and a lot of things were, uh, sort of Bildungsroman type of views.
Well, again, a Bildungsroman. I think that she sort of, I mean, if the sort of idea that she ascribes to John Stuart Mill right here, right, that the way to overcome the split between the two wills is through education. And the idea that citizens need to be educated into citizenship so that they will all share the same opinion and understand what's good and what's bad, is very much the idea that Mill has, in which he says that, to be a citizen means that you've already been educated in the proper way. And if you haven't been educated in the proper way, you either have to be ruled or educated. Arendt, spends her whole life fighting against that view, right? For her, political education has the smell of tyranny, as she puts it, in Truth and Politics. You to try and tell somebody, that that they have to be educated so that they know that this is what they're supposed to think, is for her a kind of social totalitarianism. So I think from that point of view, that's how she would understand the Bildungsroman. I mean, which is not to say that we should never try and argue for our opinion. We should, and one way to argue for it is through literature, in which we try and make people see the sense and persuasiveness of our opinions. But we shouldn't do so in a way that we suggest that there's only one truth, and anyone who disagrees with us is simply evil or mistaken. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Tessa.
Hi, thank you. So I found myself struggling a little bit with the very final section, with the introduction of time, will, and time. It's been a very long time since I've read Augustine's Confessions, where I think he most famously discusses time. But this also is in the chapter, The Discovery of the Inner Person, where it seems to me maybe time isn't a good fit. And this section ends with her talking about, or Augustine talking about spontaneity, which seems to me to be kind of outside of time, like an ever-present, always the present. And then she brings in again this issue of natality, which again seems to me to be outside of time. This fact, this kind of birth that isn't that birth that you had at the beginning of your time, but this new birth that happens, I think, outside of time. So I was just trying to figure out why bring time into this conversation about will.
Can you tell me where there's a couple of places she talks about time. Where are you talking about it? Because time is famously talked about in chapter 11, right? Or book 11 of Confessions. But where are you reading?
Well, at the very end of the section that we were supposed to read, so you stopped at love, and I was disappointed because the next issue is time, right after love. And on the very final page of the section that we're supposed to read, the final paragraph is the discussion about spontaneity and natality.
Okay. So the chapter beginning in other words, is that what you're interested in? Tessa, in other words, and somehow elaborating on these speculations, man is put into a world of change and movement as a new beginning.
Yes, that's it.
Because he knows that he has a beginning and will have an end, right?
Yeah.
Right. So I mean, this is less time, right, and more spontaneity. But the idea here is, I mean, this is again from the City of God, not the Confessions. This is where Arendt finds in Augustine this idea that there be a beginning, man was born. This idea that with man created in God's image, a being came into the world that, because it was a beginning running towards an end, could be endowed with the capacity of willing and nilling. and this is something that Arendt takes as absolutely essential to her political thinking, right? But you know, is not so much part of Augustine's idea of free will and willing, right? So that's all I was. I mean, that's all I said at the end. That in many ways, what she does is take this idea from the City of God as a way as the beginning of her critique of um, the Christian limitation of will to our inner life. And so can you say more about what you want more of?
So if I'm hearing you, so she begins with this idea of a beginning and creation, and to me, that is her introducing the notion of time and will as it exists in time. But I think I hear you saying that that's not really it.
Well, yeah, I mean, if anything, what she's trying to say is that there are, I mean, this goes back to, I think it was John or whoever was asking about the coup d'etat, right? There are moments in which action happens and simply inserts a new beginning. And and for Augustine, right? This there's this unity of the two wills is in love. But for Arendt, it's not, right? It's in a kind of radical spontaneity, not driven by love, but it just happens. It's a secular, if you will, coup d'etat. That new beginnings happen. There are breaks in time. And that for her is the beginning of will, not as the free will, right? Not as the free choice between willing and nilling, but will as Kant understood it as the faculty of spontaneously beginning a series in time, which occurring in the world can only have a relatively first beginning and still is an absolutely first beginning, not in time, but in causality. And so it's a kind of spontaneous new beginning of time, a new time sequence. And that's what, and that's the kind of, and that allows her to imagine, right? An idea of the will and freedom in politics, which is radically new, and which disrupts the continuum and is and happens for no particular reason. Again, something that Augustine would not allow, and doesn't need to be, reconciled through grace. Is that? I hope that helps.
That's good. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Haley.
Hi. So I think through your answer to Tessa, I've concluded that I'm wrong in my thinking, but let's try it. I'm finding this really difficult to get my head around. So I'm trying, the way that I am understanding how Arendt is talking about love, it feels to me like it's like a force. So when she describes love, it's like a force. And then it's making me think of other concepts that she uses and describes kind of like a force, like promising and reconciliation and that. And so I just want to check that I've got it right. So it's like love is necessarily part of plurality because it's kind of the force that holds, like we can't have plurality without love. without us kind of having that love for each other. And then I was thinking then, so if that's the case for plurality, then that's also the case with like the inner plurality. So the conflict that we have with ourselves internally, that is necessarily there through love and internal love. I feel like I'm not sure if I'm right.
No, I think you've, well, I mean, there's a part of what you're saying that's quite important, right? I mean, again, this discussion of love is not Arendt's discussion of love.
Mhm.
It's Augustine's.
Augustine.
Arendt's reading it. Now, for those of you, some of you may know that Arendt does quote Augustine on love at times in a phrase that she comes back to over and over again in her work, which is amo volo ut sis. I love you, I want you to be. And but that her reading of that is very much her own. I actually just written a fair bit on this in the book I'm working on. But let me see what I can do here. The point is that for Augustine, right? There's two different loves and two different wills, right? There's cupiditas, right? Sort of a carnal love, and caritas, spiritual love. And again, you use the word force, right? And that's right. Love for Augustine is a kind of active or volitional force that chooses and binds. For him, for Augustine, right? Love is this force that somehow unites the will and the counter will. And in that sense, love is a kind of endurance and a transcendence, unlike willing. So she says that willing for Augustine, you can will ice cream or you can will to go to theater, but it ends. It doesn't last because willing is always this back and forth, whereas love endures. If you will to go to the theater and you go, or you will to not go to the theater and you don't go, while the will, is always torn between alternatives, right? The feeling of love about not going to theater and instead contemplating God endures. It achieves a kind of permanence by surrendering to God. And so the love endures. And in enduring, this love is an experience that you have. It's not something you can know. It doesn't tell you what God is. It doesn't tell you what justice is. But it grants a kind of access to the grace of God. And in that sense, when she says that men do not become just by knowing what is just, but by loving justice, she's talking about this enduring love of justice as something that one sort of has a sense of or experience of, that can last and endure, but doesn't ever tell you exactly what it is. It's sort of like the experience of Kant's submission to the universal law. You don't know what the law actually tells you to do, but you know the experience of freedom and joy in when you do obey the universal law and set yourself under the universal law. And so you know, when Arendt takes this idea of "I love you, I want you to be," which is not sure where it comes from. I think she says it's in Augustine, but I'm not sure if it's ever actually fully in Augustine. Um, but what she means by it is, I simply want you to be as you are. I make no expectations. I don't tell you that you have to change. I free you from the Augustinian force, right? Which tells you that to be, you have to bind yourself to God, or to a certain way of being. I simply want you to be in your plurality. And so, in many ways, Arendt's lifelong engagement with Amu Voluit Sis, I love you, I want you to be, is very much counter to Augustine, but she makes it her own. It's also quite interestingly, again, I'm not going to go into this now, but the person that she first argues about this phrase, amo volut sis, with, is Heidegger, who interprets it to mean, I want you to be as you are and as you should be, very much more in the Augustinian sense. And Arendt, in many letters and in many of her writings, frees herself from the Heideggerian Augustinian reading of that to develop another idea of love, much more open to her idea of plurality, which is what she expresses in her own work, especially in the end of the imperialism section to the origins of totalitarianism, where she, in a sense, articulates this idea of amos volutis as a sort of articulation of what it means to love someone simply as a human, in the idea as an alternative to human rights, in that sense.
Thank you.
All right, Haley, thank you. Glenn.
Hey, Roger. I wish I had a question that rose to the level of your introductory remarks. That was like listening to side 2 of Abbey Road, for crying out loud. But I want to share with you what one of those sentences that just flashes for me. It's in section 9, and I have trouble reading past it. And I just want to get your take on it. It's the portion on page 80 of
All right, I'm in a different edition than you. So
right, the McCarthy edition.
So can you tell me where in section 9 it is?
She had just shared Augustine's dismantling of Stoicism, and so she's talking about apathy and that thrilling bit of etymology.
Okay. Where? What's the first?
So she
What's the
says,
paragraph? How does it begin? The paragraph?
well, it's midway. It's in the paragraph. She says, and I think this is Arendt talking.
What's the beginning of the paragraph?
This refutation, however, so plausible on this level of argument, misses a number of rather important points.
All right. Shoot, I don't see it. Is it at the beginning of?
It's about halfway, 2/3 of the way through section 9.
All right.
Anyways,
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
The sentence that just stopped me, and I'd love your take on it.
Oh, I see it. It's on page 267 for those following along. Yeah.
Thank you. After all, she says, don't we all know how relatively easy it has always been to lose at least the habit, if not the faculty of thinking? Nothing more is needed than to live in constant distraction and never leave the company of others. And like that kind of blew me away as, first of all, as an apt description of, social media's business plan, distract always and never leave people alone. But I try to use Arendt to sort of guide my life a bit. And I'm wondering what your take is of what she means by constant distraction.
Oh, well, I mean,
what are the and maybe the unseen or the harder to find evidences of constant distraction that stop me from thinking, even when I think I'm thinking, because I'm in the hive mind or whatever. What does she mean by constant distraction?
Well, constant distraction is just all the things that stop us from the difficult, dangerous task of thinking. It could mean doing drugs, although I guess if you do certain kind of drugs, it could actually maybe open your mind up to thinking. But it could certainly mean like, watching TV or listening to music or working. The things we do to numb ourselves from actually confronting the the big questions of our existence.
Would she say following the news?
Again, it could, it depends how you do it, right? I mean, if you take drugs to escape, drugs is a distraction. If you take drugs to, again, they're, whether it's ayahuasca or certain drugs that are now coming on the market that are designed to and that have the experience of opening you up to potentially other regions of consciousness, that can actually make you maybe think more in a different way. Watching the news can simply be a way of distracting you from whether real questions in your life or such, but it could also be a way of forcing you to confront viewpoints and ideas that you hadn't thought of and that you'd rather not think of. It depends what news you watch, and it depends how you react to it. I don't think there's I don't think some music can, again, distract you and just make you feel happy and dance and joy. And some music can actually maybe help you transcend to a new level of consciousness. So I don't think it's, one way or the other on any one of these things. That it's how you use them or engage them.
So joy is also a distraction then, in some ways.
Well, no, I mean, we're having our conference on joy coming up in
That's why I asked.
in the fall. And one of the premises of the conference, right, is that there's a meaningful distinction between joy and happiness. And it depends how you understand joy, but if you understand joy as simply, distraction or being happy, yeah. But if you understand joy as a kind of elevation into a kind of a new way of thinking and a transcendence of sorts that requires you to think about what's really meaningful and important in life, then joy, I think, would not be a distraction. And sort of that's one of the big questions of the conference.
Good. Thanks, Professor. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Yep. Nicole, you get the last question. Nicole? You just disappeared. Nicole, you're muted.
Yes, sorry. Yeah. So thank you very much, and hello, everybody. 3 quick points on Epictetus, the first chapter. I never know what she takes from him and what she thinks herself. That's a little bit the problem in the other. Usually it's clearer in other works, but not in this one. On the link between will and political will, alluding also to the point of John of thinking how it leads to politically. I find that often when we use the expression political will in contemporary politics, we think of it as a force, as a sort of Newtonian force that could achieve what we want. So really devoid of all the subtleties that she brings about with what will is and what will is not. So I was wondering if you think that what she writes on will is extendable to thinking smartly on political will, or if, as I think, the use of and the hope we have in political will is necessarily deceptive from an Arendt point of view. My second point is on when she says no one can harm you without your consent, citing.
¿Vamos a almorzar o no?
Please mute yourselves if you're not speaking, so we don't hear you. Go ahead, Nicole.
Second point is about victimization and the importance of it or not. When she cites Epictetus saying that no one can harm you without your consent, meaning you're not forced to be harmed when someone intends to harm you. So is it something that we could mobilize more than we do, or not? That was the second question. And the third is when you say her thinking on will is about freedom, but at one point she says will is being the cause of something. And for me, the freedom and the political is not about the cause. In what is freedom, she says clearly that it's not about the cause, and causality cannot allow for freedom, and there is this paradox sort of. So how do you see the will playing in plurality? I don't see how the articulation works, because in plurality you reveal yourself in how you act and speak. So it's not the result of will, it's something else. And there I'm not sure to understand if there is a link, and if there is a link, what is it? Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Nicole. I mean, so for the last one is the easiest one. Yeah, I mean, the problem of causality is a problem for the will. But the point is that a will cannot be caused, right? That's the point. Either a will is absolutely spontaneous or it is not. And
No,
so
but it's a cause of something else. It's a cause in itself.
it can be, yeah. And but the point is that you know, so yes, you're right that freedom, to the extent that will is free, it can't be caused, right? So we'll just stop there. On the first two questions, on the second question about harm, you know, no one can harm you without your consent. I mean, again, this is a kind of deeply stoic idea that one can separate oneself from the world. I mean, I think there's a kind of
embrace. My question is, does she embrace this, do you think, or does she not embrace this?
So she doesn't embrace the sort of fullness of stoicism, right? I mean, she's not a stoic. I you know, you raised it in the question of victimization. And I think that, you know, I think that's an interesting point, right? I mean, to what extent should we be able to look past harms and insults in the world in order to move on? And I think, you know, I don't have a full answer to this, but I certainly know that, you know, I think that you have to be able, nobody can go to the world and respond to every potential slight or harm, because we're all harmed and slighted on a regular basis. And if we live that way, we would just be overwhelmed with a kind of resentment, anger, and victimization. And yet, if you are attacked, you should, you know, to never respond would also be a denial of reality. And so, I don't think there's I don't have a standard or a scientific basis to say when one should respond and when one shouldn't. On your first question,
political will, yeah.
Political will. Yeah, I mean, again, this is one of those situations in which Arendt, you know, is very suspicious of political will as a force to achieve what we want, right? She doesn't believe in progress. She and again, as I said before in answering John, right? There's the fundamental Christian insight into, well, one of the fundamental Christian insight is that insofar as we are finite creatures, while we can to some extent articulate a will and attempt to, we have no ability to actualize it. And so, and in fact, because we're finite, we don't know what it would actually mean to actualize it, which is why one of the great statements of Hegel on this question is that the greatest evil is always done through the will to the greatest good, right? It's that we do the worst evil when we think we're trying to do good, and therefore we justify all means to our end. And insofar as we think we know how to achieve what we want to achieve, and then we for justify doing
thing outside is amazing.
So yeah, so for her, I don't think she sees political. I think she does see political will as deceptive, and we should be much more, in her mind, careful of thinking we know what justice is, or or that we should achieve justice, because most of the ideas that we would have in the attempt to achieve justice will also carry with them doing great evils and great wrongs. And that is one of her worries. That doesn't mean that she's a quietist, or that she says, don't try and make the world better. She thinks you should try to work the world better, but she thinks we should all be aware of believing too strongly in our ability to actualize our knowledge and will in politics.
Yes, thank you.
You're very welcome. All right, we have one more session before we take our summer break. So we'll meet August 1st, and we'll read chapter 3, Will and Intellect, on Thomas Aquinas and the Primus the Intellect. And then we won't be able to finish chapter 4, the conclusions, until after our break in September. And then remember, we do start the new book on revolution on September 12th. Look forward to seeing you next week. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. Thank you all very much.